Since President Bush declared war on terror, he committed the United States to a reckless and impossible task of undoing and remaking the Great Middle East region according to Washington's wishes. In the process, America invaded Afghanistan and Iraq and supported proxy wars in Palestine, Lebanon, and Somalia that has cost hundreds of thousands of lives, millions of refugees, and plunged the region into chaos and civil wars with no end in sight. Welcome. I am Marwan Bishara. As we discussed last week, America's war on Al-Qaeda has proved disastrously counterproductive, alienating most of the world by fighting and supporting open-ended wars in the Arab and Islamic worlds, while Osama bin Laden remains at large. This week, we will debate the reasons for the rise and fall of Washington's war on terror and ask who should be held responsible for the human and moral losses 7 years later. But first, a report from the front lines of America's war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan, where Al Jazeera's James Bass assesses the true cost of war.
The cost of the war on terror in Iraq has been paid in blood. Amidst all this death and destruction, it's impossible to figure out the real cost of the war to Iraqis. Estimates of the Iraqi dead range wildly, from 150,000 to 1 million.
Where are those who have mercy? We are dying because of the Americans. We are suffering because of the Americans.
It's not just the dead. 5 million Iraqis have been forced to flee their homes since 2003. That's 1 in 5 Iraqis leaving a country they no longer feel is safe. Compounding the disaster, those fleeing Iraq are precisely the people the country needs most to rebuild it. Middle-class, educated professionals. Nowhere is the situation so bleak as in the hospitals. Once among the best in the Arab Middle East, they are damaged and barely functioning. Thousands of health workers have been murdered and kidnapped. The only thing left is black humor.
I will do the surgery for you on Sunday. That's if I'm alive. And if I die, God bless you.
Despite Iraq's enormous potential oil wealth, despite the tens of billions the US has spent in the country, the economy has totally disintegrated. The poor prowl the garbage dumps, desperate for food.
I go in the afternoons after everyone else leaves because I'm ashamed. I make $2 to $2.50 every 3 days. What am I supposed to pay for with this?
The country's water is still a danger to health, and in places, sewage lies untreated on the streets. The invasion and its bloody aftermath has torn apart not just men, women and children. It may have forever shattered the very country itself. Afghanistan was supposed to be the good war, a just response to the attacks of September the 11th. It was supposed to bring bin Laden to justice and hunt out the terrorists in their lairs. But 7 years on, the reality is this. The Taliban are now stronger than at any time since 2001. The south and east of the country are war zones, and even near the capital, the security situation is getting much worse. There are now more than 70,000 troops from America and other NATO countries involved in fighting that is becoming more and more deadly. Since the start of Operation Enduring Freedom, as the invasion of Afghanistan was codenamed, close to 900 American and NATO soldiers have died. Then there are the growing civilian casualties. Every time there's collateral damage, or an unfortunate mistake like the bombing of a wedding party or the funeral where almost 100 civilians, including 60 children, were killed, it guarantees a growing opposition to the US presence. Innocent civilians are also caught up in attacks by the Taliban. For the first 3 years after the US-led invasion, there were only a handful of suicide attacks. Now they are an almost daily occurrence. The Afghan President Hamid Karzai has said no civilian casualties acceptable. He's spoken out repeatedly, on one occasion even breaking down in tears. But the mistakes keep happening. His government is rapidly losing popularity. It's not just the deterioration in the security situation, corruption in the public sector is rampant, and the economy is in a bad way. There's only one really successful industry, and it's an illegal one. Afghanistan produces more than 90% of the world's opium.
So with all this bloodshed, no sign of Osama bin Laden, and the once defeated Taliban now controlling territory in more than half the provinces in this country, who is winning George Bush's self-declared war on terror?
To discuss the implications and the logic behind the war on terror, with me in the studio is Katrina van der Havel, the editor-in-chief of The Nation magazine, Christopher Dickey, the Middle East editor for Newsweek magazine, and from Washington, Martin Lebecki, senior analyst at the RAND Corporation and co-author of the very important report, How Terrorist Groups End. Mr. Lebecki, I would like to start with you. Last week, we had with us the head of the Bin Laden unit, the former head of the Bin Laden unit at the CIA, Mr. Michael Schur. And he told us that law enforcement does not work, that America has tried it, it didn't work, and that America needs to pursue hot war against Al-Qaeda. From my understanding of your report, you disagree with that assessment.
Let me put it this way. What we found out was that most terrorist groups are more likely to be ended by the acts of law enforcement than by military force. But by law enforcement, what we generally refer to, and I think in almost all the cases, are the law enforcement of the indigenous countries. Most of the terror groups, virtually all of the terror groups that we took a look at, were terror groups that worked in particular countries. They committed acts of terror in particular countries. They were crimes within the countries that they took place, and they were, as it were, prosecuted by police.
Mr. Lebecki, America did try that against Al-Qaeda.
We conducted operations against them overseas, it is true. We helped other countries arrest them overseas, that is also true. But in fact, the law enforcement that we talked about in the report was domestic law enforcement for the most part.
Mr. Dickey here in the studio, do you agree that law enforcement will suffice to deal with Al-Qaeda?
I don't think it'll suffice to deal with Al-Qaeda. I think the problem here is that there's a false dichotomy between a law enforcement paradigm and a war paradigm. That you say cops can't handle this, therefore we have to go invade countries and occupy them, and that's the solution. And the fact is, that's not only the last solution, that's the least good solution. And it tends to create a lot more problems than it solves, as we've seen in Iraq.
Before we talk about the war itself and the cost of war in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, I need to know from you, how do you see Al-Qaeda itself? Isn't Al-Qaeda, after all, a leaderless organization nowadays? It does function in separate states anyway?
Well, I don't think it's as leaderless as all that. I think that the best analyses that I've seen suggest that there's a sort of 3 different kinds of Al-Qaeda floating around right now. One is centrally directed. One is based in the mountains of Pakistan along the Afghan borders, where you do have bin Laden, you do have Zawahiri, you do have these people trying very hard to come up with a new 9/11, trying hard to organize cadre who can do that kind of activity. But it's very difficult for them to do. Those may be safe havens for them, but they're nothing like they had in Afghanistan before 2001. And as a result, you've got other groups too. You've got groups like the London bombers,
Right.
where there's a sort of a dotted line that goes to Pakistan. And then you have groups like the Herald Square bombers here, would-be bombers here in New York, who were just idiots trying to emulate al-Qaeda.
Katrina, I think it was Barack Obama who said, America thinks, as Christopher was saying, al-Qaeda exists in some 80 countries, but America chose to invade Iraq to go after al-Qaeda.
How to explain the folly of that decision? I think we're still trying to, but I think it had a little bit to do with this idea of preventive war. But I think it has to do, Marwan, if I might say, with a mindset. And Obama has also talked about not just ending the war in Iraq, but ending the mindset that took us into the war. And I think there's a hyper-militarized mindset that still afflicts American foreign policy on bipartisan, transpartisan, and it's exiting from that and exiting from this idea of a war. There's also disruption of financial networks. There's intelligence. There are other mechanisms which were never fully used because militarization of policy was the forefront.
Mr. Lebeki, if I understand correctly,
Yes.
you don't even like the concept of war on terror. You would like it to be counter-terror.
I think that's correct. I think counter-terror makes a good deal more sense. The problem with the war on terror is, as pointed out, is you put everything into the war paradigm. There's a tendency to talk about war on crime and war on cancer and war
So
on
it's a
lots of
metaphor?
other things where the war with a metaphor just doesn't work.
Mr.
Many
Lebeki,
cases,
if I may, sir, in reality,
yes.
America did invade two countries. War is clear and present in Iraq and Afghanistan. It launched war
Correct.
by proxy in at least Somalia, and certainly supported wars in Palestine and Lebanon, all under the guise of war on terror. So for 7 years now, this has been real war.
Oh yes, I understand that, and that's the problem with the metaphor. You're exactly correct. That in fact you lose sight of the fact that it's a metaphor, and you start thinking that it's reality that you're talking
But
about.
I think
Marwan,
they wanted
it's-
a real
remains a
war. They
metaphor.
wanted a real
But
war.
they wanted a real war, but Marwan, it's an occupation. It is an occupation. It is not a war at this stage.
And does that help
there is
in
a
counter-terrorism?
difference. I hate
No,
to.
no, no. Occupation is the worst thing that you can do in
right.
fighting terrorism,
That's
because
right.
occupation is always the greatest incentive for terrorist activity.
Fruiting and
Look, the key to bin Laden's ideology, to the extent that there is one, is the idea that Muslims are fighting a defensive war. That
Bring
we
them
are,
on.
That we are being occupied. We Muslims are being occupied. We Muslims are being tortured. We Muslims are being persecuted. And therefore, any means that we use to fight back are legitimate. When you occupy countries as a means of fighting that, you only...
suicide bombings.
I would like
and
to ask you about that. I would like to ask you about that because I think that's so central. For several years now, from Stiglitz on to Woodward last week, everyone talks about the cost of war, but for some reason in America, we're always talking about the cost of war for America. You, Christopher, estimate at 2 trillion, Stiglitz at 3 trillion. We haven't spoken about the cost of war for Iraqis and Afghanis.
The war and the occupation have destroyed Iraq.
Iraq.
We have created a failed state, as others have said. And that's exactly, if that wasn't the objective, that was certainly the result.
I'm going to take this question for after the break, Mr. Lebeki. Just stay with me, and we'll be coming right after the break.